The blood-red sunset stretched across the Montana sky as Rosalie Sutherland ran barefoot through the tall grass, her breath coming in sharp, painful bursts. Her once fine dress was torn and dirty, her auburn hair wild around her shoulders. Behind her, the angry shouts of men grew louder, and the thundering of hooves shook the earth. They were gaining on her, the men who had taken everything, who had murdered her father, who had claimed her family's ranch as their own, and who now hunted her like an animal across the very land that should have been hers. "There she is," the harsh voice cut through the evening air. Rosalie pushed herself harder, but her strength was failing. 3 days without proper food or water had taken their toll. Her foot caught on a hidden rock, sending her sprawling to the ground. Before she could rise, rough hands seized her, dragging her upright. "Got the little wildcat," drawled a bearded man, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco. "Boss wants to make an example of her." "No," Rosalie fought against their grip, but it was useless. They bound her wrists with coarse rope and threw her over the back of a horse. The journey back to what had once been her family's ranch house seemed to take forever, each jolting step a fresh agony. By the time they arrived, night had fallen. The ranch yard was illuminated by torches and a roaring bonfire. A crowd of men stood around, drinking and laughing. Silas Blackburn, the man responsible for her family's destruction, stood by the fire, his cruel face lit by the dancing flames. At his feet lay a branding iron, its end glowing red-hot in the coals. "Bring her here," he commanded, and Rosalie felt ice form in her veins despite the warm night air. "You've run from me for the last time, Miss Sutherland," Blackburn said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet yard. "Every head of cattle on this ranch bears my brand, and now so will you." "You're insane," Rosalie spat, struggling against the men who held her. "This ranch belongs to my family," Blackburn laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Your family is dead, girl, and after tonight everyone will know you belong to me. Hold her down." The men forced her to the ground, stretching out her arm. One tore the sleeve of her dress, exposing the pale skin of her forearm. Terror unlike anything she had ever known coursed through her as Blackburn lifted the branding iron from the fire. "Stop, that's enough." The voice came from the darkness beyond the firelight, deep and commanding. The men turned, hands moving to their guns. A tall figure on horseback emerged from the shadows, a Winchester rifle aimed steadily at Blackburn. "This doesn't concern you, stranger," Blackburn said, though he lowered the branding iron slightly. "Ride on if you value your life." The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, keeping the rifle trained on Blackburn. In the flickering firelight, Rosalie could see him clearly now, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair beneath his worn Stetson. His face was tanned and weathered, his eyes keen beneath the brim of his hat. "I said that's enough." His voice was quiet but carried an unmistakable threat. "Let the lady go." "There are 20 of us and one of you," Blackburn sneered. "What do you think you're going to do?" The stranger's mouth curved in a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm going to put a bullet between your eyes if you don't drop that iron and untie her right now." Something in his tone made even Blackburn hesitate. In that moment of uncertainty, chaos erupted from the far side of the yard. A wagon burst through the gate, 2 men firing shotguns into the air from its bench. Blackburn's men scattered, reaching for their weapons. The distraction was all the stranger needed. He moved with the speed and precision of a mountain lion, crossing the space to Rosalie in 3 long strides. The knife appeared in his hand as if by magic, slicing through the ropes that bound her wrists with a single stroke. "Can you run?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. Rosalie nodded, her heart pounding. "Then run," he said, pulling her to her feet. "My horse is just beyond those trees." "I'll be right behind you." Gunfire erupted around them as Rosalie sprinted toward the tree line. Behind her, she heard the stranger's rifle crack once, twice. A scream told her his aim had been true. She reached the trees and found a magnificent black stallion waiting, tethered loosely to a branch. Moments later, the stranger appeared beside her. "Get on," he commanded, helping her mount before swinging up behind her. Hold tight. He spurred the horse forward and they thundered away from the ranch, bullets whistling through the air around them. Rosalie clung to the saddle horn, the stranger's arm a solid band around her waist, keeping her secure as they raced through the darkness. They rode hard for what seemed like hours, following trails only the stranger seemed to know. Finally, when the sounds of pursuit had long faded, he slowed the horse to a walk. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice softer now. "No," Rosalie managed, though her entire body ached. "Thank you, they were going to." "I know what they were going to do," he said grimly. "No man with a shred of decency would stand by and let that happen." "Who are you?" she asked, twisting slightly to see his face in the moonlight. Holt Jackson," he replied after a moment's hesitation. "I was passing through when I heard about what happened at the Sutherland ranch." "Didn't realize there were survivors." "Just me," Rosalie said, her throat tight with grief. "They killed my father 2 weeks ago, said he sold them the ranch, but it was a lie. When I tried to fight it, they burned the paperwork, killed our foreman, and came after me." Holt nodded grimly. "Blackburn's got a reputation. He's taken 3 other ranches the same way in the last year." "Where are we going?" Rosalie asked as they continued through the darkness. "I have a camp a few miles ahead. It's safe there. You can rest and we'll figure out what to do next." "We?" Rosalie questioned. "Unless you'd prefer I leave you to make your own way," Holt said, a hint of something like amusement in his voice. Despite everything, Rosalie found herself smiling faintly. "No, Mr. Jackson, I believe I'll accept your assistance for now." "Just Holt," he corrected. "And you are Rosalie Sutherland." "Well, Miss Sutherland, hold on a bit longer. We're almost there." True to his word, within half an hour they reached a small clearing beside a narrow stream. A simple camp was set up beneath the spreading branches of a cottonwood tree, a small tent, a cold fire pit, and supplies neatly arranged. Holt helped her down from the horse, and Rosalie's legs nearly gave way beneath her. He caught her arm to steady her, and even in her exhausted state she noticed the gentleness of his touch. "Sit," he instructed, guiding her to a fallen log. "When did you last eat?" "I'm not sure," Rosalie admitted. "Maybe 3 days ago. I've had water from streams, but—" Holt frowned and set about rekindling the fire. Once it was burning steadily, he heated some coffee and produced jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags. It wasn't much, but to Rosalie, it tasted better than the finest meal. As she ate, Holt tended to his horse, removing the saddle and brushing the animal down before setting it loose to graze on a long tether. His movements were efficient, practiced a man who had spent much of his life outdoors. "Why were you passing through?" Rosalie asked when he returned to the fire. "Most folks avoid this part of the territory. It's too far from the main trails." Holt paused before answering, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "I was tracking someone, a man who needs to answer for his crimes." "You're a lawman." A shadow crossed his face. "Not exactly. Let's just say I have personal business with certain individuals." Rosalie sensed there was much more to his story, but she was too tired to press further. "Well, whatever brought you here, I'm grateful." Holt nodded once, his expression softening slightly. "You should rest. Take the tent, I'll keep watch." Rosalie wanted to protest, but exhaustion was overwhelming her. "Wake me if they come." "I will," he promised. "But I don't think they'll find us tonight. Blackburn's men aren't known for their tracking skills." Too tired to argue, Rosalie crawled into the small tent. Despite her fear and grief, the rhythmic sounds of the night and the knowledge that Holt Jackson was keeping watch lulled her into the first peaceful sleep she'd had in weeks. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. For a moment, disoriented, she thought she was back home, that her father would be sitting at the kitchen table reading the newspaper, that the past terrible weeks had been nothing but a nightmare. Then reality crashed back and she remembered where she was and how she had gotten there. Rosalie emerged from the tent to find Holt crouched by the fire, turning strips of bacon in a small skillet. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. "Morning," he said. "Coffee's ready if you want some." "Thank you." Rosalie accepted the tin cup he offered, wrapping her fingers around its warmth. The morning was cool, mist rising from the stream and clinging to the tall grass around their camp. "Did you sleep at all?" "Enough," he replied, which she suspected meant hardly at all. "We should move on after breakfast. Blackburn's not the type to give up easily." "Where will we go?" Holt considered this as he removed the bacon from the fire. "There's a settlement about 2 days' ride west of here. Cedar Ridge. The sheriff there, Bill Cooper, is an honest man. We can tell him what happened." "And then what?" Rosalie asked, accepting the plate of bacon and hardtack he handed her. "Blackburn has friends in the territorial government. My father tried going through official channels when Blackburn started threatening us. It only made things worse." Holt's jaw tightened. "Then we'll find another way to get your ranch back." Rosalie questioned again, studying his face. "Mr. Jackson, I'm grateful for your help, but this isn't your fight. You've already risked your life for a stranger once. I can't ask you to do more." "You didn't ask," Holt said simply. "And I've got my own reasons for wanting to see Blackburn brought down." He stood, dumping the remains of his coffee onto the ground. "If we make good time, we can reach the foothills by nightfall. Harder to track us there." They broke camp quickly, Holt moving with the efficiency of someone accustomed to traveling light and fast. Within 20 minutes, all evidence of their presence had been erased, and they were on horseback again, Rosalie seated behind Holt this time. "Hold on," he instructed, and then they were off, the powerful black horse carrying them swiftly through the rolling grasslands. As they rode, Rosalie found herself studying the man who had saved her life. Holt Jackson was not what she would call traditionally handsome, but there was something compelling about his strong profile, the determined set of his jaw. His hands, she noticed, were calloused and strong on the reins, yet they had been gentle when helping her mount. Who was this man, really? And what had brought him to her rescue? They stopped briefly at midday to rest the horse and eat a small meal of jerky and the last of the hardtack. Holt seemed preoccupied, scanning the horizon frequently, alert to any sign of pursuit. "Tell me about your ranch," he said suddenly as they sat in the shade of a lone cottonwood tree. Rosalie looked at him in surprise. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. How long your family had it, what you raised, how Blackburn came into the picture." So Rosalie told him about the Lazy S, the ranch her grandfather had built and her father had expanded. How they raised cattle primarily, but also kept horses, her mother's passion, before she died of fever when Rosalie was 12. How Blackburn had appeared 6 months ago, claiming he wanted to buy neighboring land. At first, he seemed legitimate, offered fair prices to the Hendersons for their spread when they decided to move back east. But then things changed. The Hendersons were found dead before they could leave. Blackburn produced paperwork saying he'd bought their place. After that, it was the Whittakers, then Old Man Collins. Each time, the owners either died or disappeared, and Blackburn somehow had the deeds. "And then he came for your father," Holt said quietly. Rosalie nodded, fighting back tears. "Dad refused to sell, no matter how much Blackburn offered. Then the threats started. Our cattle began disappearing. One of our line shacks was burned. Dad went to the marshal in Silver Creek, but nothing came of it. And then 2 weeks ago, I rode out to check on one of our herds and came back to find." Her voice broke. Holt didn't press her to continue. Instead, he reached out, hesitated, then awkwardly patted her shoulder. The gesture, clumsy as it was, conveyed more genuine comfort than all the polished condolences she'd received after her mother's death. "We should keep moving," he said after a moment. "There's a storm coming." He nodded toward the western sky where dark clouds were gathering. They rode hard through the afternoon, the landscape gradually changing from open prairie to rolling hills dotted with pines. The storm caught them as the sun was setting, rain lashing down in heavy sheets. "There's a line shack about a mile ahead," Holt shouted over the thunder. "Used to belong to the Bar T outfit, but they went under last year. Should be empty." The shack was little more than a one-room cabin with a sagging roof and a single window, but it was dry and had a stone fireplace. Holt took care of his horse first, rigging a makeshift shelter from canvas and branches before joining Rosalie inside. He was soaked to the skin, water dripping from his hat and coat. Rosalie wasn't much better off, her dress clinging to her uncomfortably. In the small confines of the shack, she suddenly became acutely aware of their situation alone together, miles from civilization. As if reading her thoughts, Holt cleared his throat. "I'll get a fire going," he said, moving to the fireplace. "You should change into something dry if you have it." "I don't have anything," Rosalie admitted. "I've been running for days. Everything I own is back at the ranch." Holt frowned, then rummaged in his saddlebags. He pulled out a worn flannel shirt and offered it to her. "It's clean," he said, "more or less, better than catching pneumonia." Rosalie accepted it with murmured thanks. Holt busied himself with the fire, carefully keeping his back turned while she changed behind him. The shirt was enormous on her, reaching almost to her knees, but it was dry and smelled of pine and tobacco, not unpleasant. "You can turn around now," she said, wringing out her dress and hanging it near the growing fire. When Holt turned, something flickered in his eyes as he took in the sight of her in his shirt, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. He quickly looked away, removing his own wet coat and hanging it beside her dress. The storm raged outside, rain drumming on the roof and wind howling through the cracks in the walls. Despite the fire, the shack was cold. They sat side by side, not quite touching, sharing a meal of canned beans Holt had produced from his seemingly inexhaustible saddlebags. "You travel well prepared," Rosalie observed. "Habit," Holt replied. "Learned a long time ago that being unprepared out here can kill you." "Where are you from originally?" she asked. "Your accent isn't Montana, all over," he said vaguely. "Born in Kentucky, left when I was 16, been moving ever since. For how long? 12 years, give or take." So he was around 28, Rosalie calculated. Only 6 years older than she was, though the hardness in his eyes made him seem older. "What about you?" he asked, surprising her. "You don't talk like someone who spent her whole life on a Montana ranch." Rosalie smiled faintly. "My mother was from Boston. She insisted I be properly educated. I spent 4 years at a girls' school back east before coming home." "When was that?" 2 years ago. I was supposed to stay longer, maybe even find a suitable husband." She couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "But I missed the ranch, and father was alone, so I came home." Holt nodded, seemingly unsurprised. Not many women would choose ranch life over Boston society. "I'm not many women," Rosalie said, lifting her chin slightly. For the first time since she'd met him, Holt smiled a genuine smile that transformed his face, softening the hard lines and lighting his eyes. "No," he agreed, "you certainly aren't." The moment stretched between them, strangely intimate in the firelit darkness. Then Holt cleared his throat and stood, breaking the spell. "We should get some rest," he said. "Long ride tomorrow if we want to reach Cedar Ridge." There was only one bedroll, which Holt insisted Rosalie take. He would sleep, he said, propped against the wall near the door, his rifle across his lap. Rosalie wanted to argue but knew it would be futile. This man, she was learning, had a stubborn streak a mile wide when it came to what he considered his duty. "Good night, Mr. Jackson," she said, settling into the bedroll. "Holt," he corrected, his voice soft in the darkness. "Good night, Miss Sutherland." "Rosalie," she replied, and thought she heard a low chuckle in response. Despite her exhaustion, sleep came fitfully. Every crack of thunder made her start, and images of Blackburn with the glowing branding iron kept intruding on her thoughts. Eventually, she drifted into an uneasy slumber, only to be woken by a hand gently shaking her shoulder. "Rosalie," Holt's voice was urgent but quiet. "Wake up. Someone's coming." She sat up instantly, fully alert. "Blackburn?" "Don't know yet. Heard horses." Holt was already at the window, peering through a gap in the shutters. Dawn was breaking, casting pale light across the wet landscape. 3 riders coming up the trail. Moving slow like they're tracking. Rosalie's heart raced. "What do we do?" Holt considered for a moment. "We can't outrun them in this mud and they'd see our tracks anyway." He handed her his pistol. "Take this. Hide behind the bed. If anything happens to me, don't hesitate to shoot." Before she could protest, he was moving to the door, rifle in hand. He positioned himself to the side of the entrance, where he would be hidden when the door opened but would have a clear shot at anyone entering. The minutes stretched interminably as the sound of hoofbeats grew louder. Then came voices, too indistinct at first to make out words. Rosalie gripped the pistol tightly, her palms sweating. "Tracks lead right here," a man's voice said, now close enough to hear clearly. "Could be anyone," another replied. "Lot of travelers use these old line shacks." In this weather, with Blackburn offering $50 for information about a girl and a fella matching their description. Worth checking. Holt tensed, his finger moving to the trigger of his rifle. Rosalie held her breath as the footsteps approached the door. The latch lifted and the door began to swing open. "Hello, the house," a voice called. "Anyone home?" Holt remained silent, his rifle aimed at the opening door. A man stepped into view, not one of Blackburn's men, but a stranger in a rain-slicked duster. Just looking for shelter from he froze when he saw Holt's rifle aimed at his chest. "Easy now," the stranger said, raising his hands slowly. "We don't mean any harm." "Who's we?" Holt demanded, not lowering his weapon. "Me and my brothers. We're heading to Cedar Ridge." "Got caught in the storm." "You mentioned Blackburn," Holt said, his voice hard. "Said he's offering money for information." The man swallowed visibly. Word spreading through the territory. "Blackburn's offering rewards for a young woman and the man who took her. Says the man kidnapped her, but—" He hesitated. "That didn't sound right to me. Blackburn's got a reputation." Holt studied the man for a long moment, then slowly lowered his rifle, though he kept it ready. "Tell your brothers to come in, slowly. Any sudden moves and I'll drop all three of you." The man nodded and stepped back to the doorway. "It's all right, boys. Come on in. Nice and easy." Two more men entered, cautiously younger versions of the first, with the same dark hair and cautious expressions. All three had the weathered look of working cowboys. "I'm Thomas Weber," the first man said. "These are my brothers, Samuel and John. We worked for the Circle W until the owner died last month, heading to Cedar Ridge to look for work." Holt nodded slightly. "Holt Jackson." "And I'm Rosalie Sutherland," Rosalie said, standing up from behind the bed, still holding the pistol. "Of the Lazy S Ranch." Recognition flashed in Thomas Weber's eyes. "Sutherland, we heard what happened. Terrible business. They're saying Blackburn has legal claim to your ranch, but—" "It's a lie," Rosalie said firmly. "He murdered my father and forged documents, and last night he tried to brand me like cattle to mark me as his property." The Weber brothers exchanged dark looks. "That matches what we heard in Silver Creek," Samuel, the middle brother, said. "Talk is, Blackburn's gone too far this time. Some folks are starting to ask questions." "Not enough to stop him," Holt observed grimly. "No," Thomas agreed, "but enough that not everyone's willing to help him hunt you down." An idea began to form in Rosalie's mind. "How many in Silver Creek feel that way?" Thomas considered. "Hard to say. The marshal's in Blackburn's pocket, but the ordinary folks. Most are scared, but there's plenty who have lost friends or kin to Blackburn's expansion, if someone stood up to him." "Someone is," Rosalie said, a new determination in her voice. She looked at Holt. "We don't need to run to Cedar Ridge, we need to go back to Silver Creek." Holt stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Blackburn will be waiting for us there." "Exactly," Rosalie said. "He thinks I'm running scared. He won't expect me to confront him publicly with witnesses if we can gather enough support from the townspeople." "It's too dangerous," Holt said flatly. "More dangerous than spending the rest of my life running," Rosalie challenged. "I want my home back, Holt. And I want justice for my father." The Weber brothers watched this exchange with interest. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat. "If you're heading back to Silver Creek, we'd ride with you. Our pa knew Roy Sutherland, did business with him for years. He was a good man." Holt's expression was thunderous, but Rosalie could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. "4 guns are better than 1, she pointed out softly. After a long moment, Holt sighed. "This is a fool's errand," he said, "but I promise to help you get your ranch back. If this is how you want to do it, I won't stop you." "Thank you," Rosalie said, touching his arm briefly. "Don't thank me yet," Holt muttered. "This could get us all killed." They set out an hour later after a hurried breakfast of coffee and the last of Holt's provisions. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky washed clean and blue. The Weber brothers had horses of their own, solid quarter horses that looked capable of covering ground quickly. Rosalie rode behind Holt again, her arms around his waist, acutely aware of the solid strength of him. "Tell me about Silver Creek," Holt said as they rode. "I passed through but didn't stay long." "It's small," Rosalie replied. "Maybe 500 people. One main street with the usual general store, saloon, hotel, livery. The marshal's office is at the far end of town. Churches, too. Methodist and Baptist. And the people, who has influence?" Rosalie thought about this. "Mr. Hargrove at the general store, everyone respects him. Mrs. Whitfield, who runs the boarding house, her husband was one of Blackburn's early victims. Dr. Collins treats everyone, rich or poor. And Reverend Adams from the Methodist Church speaks his mind, even when it's not popular." Holt nodded thoughtfully. "Those are the people we need to talk to first. If we can get them on our side, others will follow." "What exactly is your plan?" Thomas Weber asked, riding alongside them. "I'm still working on that," Holt admitted. "But it starts with getting into town without Blackburn's men spotting us and gathering enough support to force a public reckoning." "Easier said than done," John Weber remarked. "Blackburn's got men watching all the roads into town." "Then we don't use the roads," Holt said. "There's a back way in through the creek bed on the east side. Used to be an old Indian trail. Most folks have forgotten it exists." "How do you know about it?" Rosalie asked, curious. A shadow crossed Holt's face. "I've been in these parts before." "A long time ago." The way he said it, with a hint of old pain, made Rosalie want to ask more, but something in his posture told her not to press. There were clearly depths to Holt Jackson that he kept carefully hidden. They rode steadily through the day, avoiding the main trails and keeping to the shelter of wooded areas when possible. By late afternoon, they could see Silver Creek in the distance, a cluster of buildings nestled in a valley. "We'll wait until dark," Holt decided. Less chance of being seen that way. They made a cold camp in a grove of pines overlooking the town, not risking a fire that might give away their position. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Rosalie found herself standing slightly apart from the others, gazing at the town that had been the center of her world for most of her life. Holt joined her, his footsteps nearly silent on the pine needles. "Having second thoughts?" He asked quietly. "No," Rosalie said. "Just remembering, I used to ride into town with my father every Saturday. We'd have lunch at the hotel, then do our shopping. Everyone knew us, respected us." She turned to look at him. "How did it come to this? How could people stand by while a man like Blackburn took everything?" "Fear is a powerful motivator," Holt said. "Most folks just want to protect themselves and their families. They'll look the other way if trouble doesn't touch them directly." "Is that what you think of people? That they're all cowards at heart?" Holt was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant town. "No," he said finally. "I think most people are decent enough when given the chance, but it often takes one person willing to stand up first to show them it's possible to fight back." "Like you did," Rosalie said softly, "when you stopped Blackburn from branding me." Holt shrugged, looking uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same, but they didn't. You did." Impulsively, Rosalie reached out and took his hand. "Thank you, Holt. Not just for saving me, but for staying, for helping me fight." His hand was warm around hers, calloused and strong. For a moment, he seemed at a loss for words, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Then he gently squeezed her hand before releasing it. "We should get back to the others," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Need to finalize our plan for tonight." As darkness fell, they prepared to move. The plan was simple, perhaps too simple. They would enter town via the Old Creek Bed Trail. make their way to the Methodist church, where Reverend Adams lived in an adjoining parsonage, and seek his help in gathering the influential townspeople Rosalie had mentioned. If we can convince them to stand with us, we can confront Blackburn publicly tomorrow, Holt explained. Force him to answer for his crimes with the whole town as witness. And if we can't convince them, Samuel Weber asked, Holt's expression was grim, then we're probably dead by morning. They left the horses hidden in the pines, except for Holt's black stallion, which they couldn't risk being found. With Rosalie again riding behind Holt and the Weber brothers on foot, they made their way down the steep hillside in the darkness. The old trail was barely visible, overgrown and eroded by years of neglect, but Holt navigated it confidently. They followed the dry creek bed for nearly a mile before it curved toward the eastern edge of town. Silver Creek after dark was quiet, with most respectable businesses closed for the night. Only the saloon showed signs of life, yellow light and piano music spilling onto the street. They skirted the main thoroughfare, keeping to the shadows of alleyways and side streets. The Methodist church stood on the north end of town, a simple white clapboard building with a modest steeple. The parsonage beside it was dark except for a single window glowing with lamplight. "Wait here with the horse," Holt told the Weber brothers. "If anything goes wrong, you'll hear it. Be ready to run." With Rosalie at his side, Holt approached the parsonage's back door and knocked softly. After a moment, they heard footsteps and the door opened a crack. "Who's there?" came an elderly man's voice. "Reverend Adams." Rosalie stepped forward into the spill of light. "It's Rosalie Sutherland. I need your help." The door opened wider to reveal a thin man with white hair and kind eyes widened in shock. "Miss Sutherland, good Lord, child, we thought you were dead. Come in quickly." They stepped into a small, neat kitchen. Reverend Adams stared at them both, his expression moving from shock to concern. "What happened? The whole town's been told you ran off after your father's death, then stole money and disappeared." "That's a lie," Rosalie said fiercely. "Blackburn murdered my father, forged documents claiming ownership of our ranch, and has been hunting me ever since. Last night he tried to brand me like an animal." The Reverend's face paled. "Dear God, I knew there was something not right about that man, but this." He looked at Holt. "And you are Holt Jackson," he replied. "I happened to be passing by the Sutherland ranch when Blackburn was about to carry out his branding. I helped Miss Sutherland escape." "For which Blackburn has put a price on your head," the Reverend said gravely. "His men have been asking questions all over town. $50 for information, $500 for the girl returned alive." "We need your help, Reverend," Rosalie said. "We need to gather people who will stand with us against Blackburn people whose word carries weight in Silver Creek." Reverend Adams stroked his chin thoughtfully. "It won't be easy. Blackburn has the marshal in his pocket and many are afraid." He considered for a moment. "But not everyone. Let me think. Hannah Whitfield would stand with you, certainly. Her husband was one of Blackburn's first victims, Dr. Collins has been troubled by the number of accidents among landowners who refuse to sell. And old Jacob Hargrove has no love for Blackburn after what happened to his son." "What happened to his son?" Holt asked, beaten nearly to death for speaking out against Blackburn's methods. "He recovered but had to be sent east to live with relatives, too dangerous for him here." Holt and Rosalie exchanged glances. "Can you arrange a meeting?" Rosalie asked. "Tonight, if possible." "I can try," the Reverend said. "Where would be safe?" "Not here," Holt said firmly. "Blackburn might have men watching your house. Is there somewhere less obvious?" Reverend Adams thought for a moment. "The old Thompson place. It's been vacant since Mrs. Thompson passed last winter. On the edge of town, set back from the road. I have a key. I've been looking after the property until the heirs decide what to do with it." "That would work," Holt agreed. "How soon can you gather people? Give me an hour. I'll need to be discreet." While they waited for Reverend Adams to contact the others, Rosalie and Holt remained in the parsonage kitchen. The Weber brothers kept watch outside, alert for any sign of Blackburn's men. Reverend Adams returned 45 minutes later, looking pleased. "They'll meet us at the Thompson place in half an hour." All three agreed without hesitation, and Jacob Hargrove suggested we include Ethan Parker, the banker. He's been keeping records of Blackburn's suspicious transactions. "That's perfect," Rosalie said, hope rising in her chest for the first time in weeks. They slipped out of the parsonage by the back door and made their way through the darkened streets to the Thompson house, a modest two-story home on a large corner lot surrounded by ancient oak trees. The Weber brothers followed at a distance, keeping watch. The house was dusty and musty-smelling but intact, its furniture draped with sheets to protect it from dust. Reverend Adams lit several lamps, casting warm pools of light in the otherwise gloomy parlor. The others arrived in ones and twos over the next 20 minutes. First, Hannah Whitfield, a dignified woman in her 50s whose eyes filled with tears when she saw Rosalie. Then Jacob Hargrove, the storekeeper, a burly man with a bushy gray beard, followed by Dr. Collins, thin and scholarly-looking, and finally Ethan Parker, the banker, a nervous man who kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting trouble. "I can hardly believe my eyes," Hannah Whitfield said, embracing Rosalie. "When they said you'd run off, I never believed it, but to see you alive." "I'm alive thanks to Mr. Jackson," Rosalie said, gesturing to Holt, who stood somewhat awkwardly by the parlor door. Each of the townspeople had their own story to tell: how Blackburn had gradually taken control of the region, how threats and violence had silenced opposition, how the territorial authorities seemed curiously uninterested in investigating the pattern of deaths and disappearances. "He's careful," Ethan Parker explained. "The paperwork always looks legitimate, even when we know it can't be, and those who might testify against him have a habit of dying or disappearing. But if enough people stand together," Rosalie argued, "he can't silence everyone." "What exactly are you proposing?" Dr. Collins asked. Holt stepped forward. "A public confrontation. Tomorrow morning on the main street with as many witnesses as possible. Blackburn won't expect Miss Sutherland to return and challenge him openly. The surprise might be enough to force him into making a mistake. Or he might just have you both shot on sight," Jacob Hargrove pointed out bluntly. "Not if half the town is watching," Holt countered. "Blackburn has worked hard to maintain a facade of legitimacy. He wants people to believe he's a businessman, not a murderer." "Mr. Parker," Rosalie said, turning to the banker, "you mentioned you've kept records of Blackburn's transactions. Would you be willing to bring those records to the confrontation? To show publicly how he's manipulated deeds and ownership papers." The banker hesitated, fear evident in his face. "I could lose everything. My position, maybe my life." "We all could," Hannah Whitfield said quietly. "But at what point do we say enough is enough? I lost my Edward to that monster. How many more will we lose if no one stands against him?" A heavy silence fell over the room. Finally, Jacob Hargrove spoke. "My boy nearly died because he spoke the truth about Blackburn. I sent him away to save his life, and I've regretted my cowardice every day since." The big man's voice broke slightly. "I'll stand with you, Miss Sutherland." "As will I," Hannah Whitfield declared. Dr. Collins nodded his agreement. "It's time someone held Blackburn accountable." All eyes turned to Ethan Parker. The banker looked at each face in turn, then straightened his shoulders. "Very well, I'll bring the records. God help us all." A plan began to take shape. The following morning was Saturday market day in Silver Creek, when the town would be at its busiest. At 10 o'clock, when Blackburn typically took his morning coffee on the hotel veranda overlooking the main street, they would confront him publicly. "The more witnesses, the better," Reverend Adams said. "I'll speak to my congregation, discreetly of course, but enough to ensure a good crowd." "I can do the same," Hannah Whitfield added. "Many of the women in town use my boarding house for their quilting circle. They'll spread the word to their husbands." "What about the marshal?" Holt asked, addressing the obvious concern. "He's Blackburn's man. He could shut this down before it starts." "Leave Marshal Dawson to me," Dr. Collins said with a grim smile. I happen to know he's due for a severe case of stomach distress tomorrow morning, nothing life-threatening but certainly enough to keep him occupied for several hours. Rosalie looked around at these people, virtual strangers, some of whom she knew only by sight or reputation, who were willing to risk everything to help her. A lump formed in her throat. "I don't know how to thank you all." "No thanks needed, child," Hannah Whitfield said gently. "Your father was a good man. He would have done the same for any of us." As the meeting broke up, plans in place for the next morning, Holt pulled Rosalie aside. "You should stay here tonight," he said in a low voice. "Mrs. Whitfield has offered to remain with you. It's safer than trying to find another hiding place." "Where will you go?" Rosalie asked, suddenly anxious at the thought of separation. "The Weber brothers and I will keep watch from different points around town. Make sure Blackburn doesn't get wind of what's coming." "Be careful," Rosalie said, surprising herself by reaching out to touch his arm. "I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because of me." Something flickered in Holt's eyes, a warmth that had nothing to do with the lamplight. "I've survived worse," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Just be ready tomorrow. Once this starts, there's no turning back." "I know," Rosalie said, "but it's the only way I'll ever get my life back." Holt hesitated, then reached out and briefly touched her cheek, a gesture so gentle it made her breath catch. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow will test us all." After he left with the Weber brothers, Hannah Whitfield helped Rosalie prepare for the night. The older woman found clean linens for one of the bedrooms and insisted on making a pot of tea before they retired. "That Mr. Jackson," Hannah remarked as they sat in the kitchen, warming their hands around their teacups. "He seems quite devoted to your cause for a man who was just passing by." Rosalie felt heat rise in her cheeks. "He saved my life. I suppose he feels responsible for seeing this through." Hannah's knowing smile suggested she wasn't convinced by this explanation. "I've been around long enough to recognize when a man looks at a woman as more than just someone he's obligated to help." "It's not like that," Rosalie protested, though the memory of Holt's touch on her cheek lingered. "We barely know each other." "Sometimes it doesn't take long to know what matters," Hannah said wisely. "My Edward asked me to marry him 1 week after we met. Everyone said we were rushing, that it couldn't last. We had 32 wonderful years together before Blackburn took him from me." Her eyes grew misty with memory. Rosalie reached across the table to take the older woman's hand. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Whitfield." "Hannah, please." She squeezed Rosalie's hand. "And don't be sorry, be determined. What we're doing tomorrow isn't just for you or for those of us who have lost loved ones. It's for everyone in this town who deserves to live without fear." Rosalie slept fitfully that night, her dreams a chaotic mix of branding irons, her father's face, and Holt's eyes watching her from the darkness. She woke at dawn, tense with anticipation of what the day would bring. Hannah had brought a clean dress for her, nothing fancy, but clean and whole, unlike the tattered garment she'd been wearing for days. The simple act of changing clothes, of washing her face and arranging her hair, made Rosalie feel more like herself again, more ready to face what was coming. By 9 o'clock, they could hear the sounds of the town coming to life, wagons rattling down the main street, voices calling greetings, the general bustle of market day. Reverend Adams arrived at 9:30, his expression grave but determined. "It's working," he reported. "Word has spread. The street is unusually crowded for this time of morning, and I've seen people positioning themselves near the hotel veranda." "Any sign of Blackburn?" Rosalie asked. "He arrived at the hotel for breakfast at his usual time. He's there now, apparently unaware of what's brewing." "And the marshal?" Hannah asked. Reverend Adams' lips twitched in what might almost have been a smile. "Dr. Collins reports that Marshal Dawson is indisposed, quite severely indisposed. He won't be interfering." At 9:45, Jacob Hargrove arrived with Ethan Parker. The banker was pale but resolute, clutching a leather portfolio that presumably contained the damning records. "Are we ready?" Rosalie asked, looking around at their small group. "As ready as we'll ever be," Jacob replied. The Weber brothers are positioned at either end of the main street. If Blackburn's men try anything, they'll be watching. And Mr. Jackson, Rosalie couldn't keep the concern from her voice, already in position near the hotel, said he'll meet us there. Jacob hesitated. Miss Sutherland, you should know there are at least a dozen of Blackburn's men in town today. They're trying not to be obvious about it, but they're armed and watching. This could get ugly. Rosalie nodded, a cold determination settling over her. I understand the risk, we all do. But I won't spend the rest of my life running from the man who murdered my father and tried to treat me like property. At precisely 10 o'clock, they left the Thompson house and walked together down the main street of Silver Creek. Rosalie in the lead, her head held high. People stopped to stare, whispers spreading rapidly through the crowd. By the time they reached the hotel, a sizable gathering had formed, everyone sensing that something momentous was about to happen. Silas Blackburn sat at his usual table on the hotel veranda, a newspaper open before him, a cup of coffee at his elbow. He looked up as the murmuring of the crowd grew louder, his expression changing from annoyance to shock as he spotted Rosalie approaching. Good morning, Mr. Blackburn, Rosalie said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush that fell over the street. Surprised to see me alive and unbranded, Blackburn recovered quickly, his face settling into a mask of concern. Miss Sutherland, thank God you're safe. We've been searching everywhere for you since you ran off. He rose from his chair, taking a step toward her. Where have you been, my dear, and why are you dressed like that? Don't my dear me, Rosalie said coldly. Every person here knows what you did to my father, what you tried to do to me. Blackburn's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. I don't know what you're talking about. Your father sold me the ranch fair and square before his unfortunate accident. As for you, well, grief can make people do strange things, running away, making wild accusations. Liar, Jacob Hargrove stepped forward, his deep voice booming. Roy Sutherland would never sell to the likes of you. He told me so himself the day before you had him killed. Blackburn's facade of concern was beginning to crack. Mind your accusations, Hargrove. Slander is a serious offense. Truth is a defense against slander, Ethan Parker said, stepping forward with his portfolio. And I have the truth right here, records of every suspicious land transaction you've conducted in this territory. Every forged deed, every mysterious death followed by a transfer of property. The crowd was growing larger, people pressing closer to hear. Blackburn's eyes darted around, clearly looking for his men. Rosalie spotted several of them on the edges of the gathering, hands hovering near their guns, but they seemed hesitant to act with so many witnesses. This is absurd, Blackburn snapped, his genial mask slipping further. Marshal Dawson will put a stop to this nonsense immediately. The marshal is indisposed, Dr. Collins said mildly. Terrible case of stomach trouble, might be days before he's on his feet again. A ripple of nervous laughter went through the crowd. Blackburn's face darkened with anger. I don't have to stand here and listen to these unfounded accusations. I am a respected businessman. You're a murderer, Rosalie cut in. A thief who takes what isn't his. You killed my father, you forged documents claiming ownership of our ranch, and when I refused to accept it, you hunted me down and tried to brand me like an animal. She stepped closer, her voice rising. I want everyone here to know exactly what kind of man you are. I want them to know that 2 nights ago, you had me tied down and were about to press a red-hot branding iron to my skin. Gasps and murmurs of horror spread through the crowd. Women clutched their children closer, men exchanged dark looks. That's a damned lie, Blackburn snarled, his pretense of civility abandoned. Is it? The voice came from behind Blackburn. Holt stepped onto the veranda, his tall figure radiating quiet menace. I was there, Blackburn. I saw what you were about to do. Just like I saw what you did to the Hendersons and to Collins and to Whitfield. Blackburn went very still. Who the hell are you? Someone who's been tracking you for a long time, Holt said. Someone who made a promise to see justice done. Something like recognition flickered in Blackburn's eyes. "Jackson," he breathed. "You're Henry Jackson's boy." A murmur went through the crowd. Rosalie looked at Holt in confusion. His face had gone hard as stone, his eyes fixed on Blackburn with cold intensity. "My father's name was Morgan Jackson," he said quietly. "He had a small spread near Broken Pine. 10 years ago, you wanted his water rights. When he wouldn't sell, you burned him out. My mother died in that fire." Blackburn's hand moved toward his coat, but Holt was faster. His gun appeared as if by magic, aimed squarely at Blackburn's chest. "Don't," Holt warned. "Not unless you want this to end right here." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Then, from the edge of the crowd, one of Blackburn's men made his move, drawing his pistol. Before he could aim, a shot rang out and he dropped with a cry, clutching his shoulder. Thomas Weber stood 20 feet away, his smoking gun still raised. It was like a signal. Suddenly guns were being drawn all around, Blackburn's men moving to protect their boss, townspeople producing weapons of their own. Women and children scrambled for cover as the main street became a standoff. "Stop," Rosalie shouted, stepping into the open space between the opposing sides. "There's been enough violence, enough death." Her courageous move created a momentary pause. Then Blackburn, seeing an opportunity, lunged forward and grabbed her, pulling her against him as a shield. The cold barrel of his pistol pressed against her temple. "Nobody move," he shouted. "Or she dies right here." Holt froze, his gun still aimed but now useless with Rosalie in the line of fire. The entire street went deathly quiet. "Here's what's going to happen," Blackburn said, his voice tight with desperation. "I'm going to walk out of town with the girl. Anyone tries to stop me, I'll put a bullet in her head." "And then what?" Holt asked, his voice controlled despite the fear Rosalie could see in his eyes. "You kill her, we kill you. Is that how you want this to end?" "I'll take my chances," Blackburn snarled. "Now back off, all of you." The crowd reluctantly gave way as Blackburn began edging toward a horse tethered nearby, dragging Rosalie with him. She could feel his heart racing against her back, smell the fierce sweat on him. This was a man who knew he was cornered, and that made him more dangerous than ever. As they reached the horse, Blackburn hissed in her ear, "You should have accepted your fate, girl. Now you'll die like your father." In that moment, something snapped inside Rosalie. A lifetime of being told to be ladylike, to be proper, to accept what she couldn't change, all of it fell away. With a strength born of rage and desperation, she drove her elbow hard into Blackburn's ribs, simultaneously stamping down on his instep with all her weight. The sudden attack caught him off guard. His grip loosened just enough for Rosalie to twist away, dropping to the ground and rolling clear. Blackburn's gun discharged, the bullet whining harmlessly into the air. Before he could aim again, Holt was on him. The two men crashed to the ground, wrestling for control of the weapon. It went off again, and Holt grunted in pain but didn't release his grip. They rolled in the dirt, each fighting with grim determination. Finally, with a violent twist, Holt wrenched the gun from Blackburn's grasp and flung it away. He straddled the older man, one hand at his throat, the other drawn back in a fist. "For my mother," Holt said, his voice deadly quiet as he delivered a crushing blow to Blackburn's face. "For Roy Sutherland." Another blow. "For every person you've ever hurt or killed." A third blow left Blackburn bloody and barely conscious. Holt raised his fist again, his face a mask of rage and pain accumulated over years. Rosalie moved to his side, gently touching his arm. "Holt," she said softly, "enough, he'll face justice now, real justice." For a moment she thought he might not stop, that the need for vengeance was too deeply ingrained. Then his eyes met hers and something in them shifted. Slowly he lowered his hand. "You're right," he said hoarsely. "He's not worth hanging for." Around them, Blackburn's men were being disarmed by townspeople who had finally found the courage to stand together. The threat had broken, like a fever passing, leaving everyone shaken but resolute. Jacob Hargrove approached, a length of rope in his hands. "We'll hold him in the jail until the federal marshal can be summoned from Helena," he said. "Him and his men both." As Blackburn was being tied up, Rosalie noticed the dark stain spreading on Holt's shirt. "You're shot," she said, alarmed. Holt glanced down as if noticing the wound for the first time. "Just grazed me," he said, though the tightness around his eyes told a different story. "Dr. Collins," Rosalie called, "Mr. Jackson is injured." The doctor hurried over, insisting on examining the wound despite Holt's protests. "Not life-threatening," he pronounced after a brief inspection, "but it needs cleaning and stitching. Come to my office at once." "In a minute," Holt said, his eyes still on Rosalie. "There's something I need to do first." To her surprise, he took her hand and led her a few steps away from the crowd, into the relative privacy of the hotel's side porch. "I should have told you about my connection to Blackburn," he said without preamble, "about why I was really tracking him." "It wouldn't have changed anything," Rosalie said, "except perhaps I would have understood sooner why you were willing to help a stranger." Holt shook his head. "You weren't just a stranger, Rosalie, not from the moment I saw you fighting back against those men, refusing to be broken." His hand tightened around hers. "You reminded me there are things worth fighting for besides revenge." Rosalie's heart quickened at his words, at the look in his eyes as he gazed down at her. "What happens now?" she asked. "Will you stay, or do you have somewhere else to be?" It was the question that had been haunting her since they'd formed their plan to confront Blackburn. What would happen afterward? Would Holt Jackson, this man who had saved her in more ways than one, simply ride away once justice was done? "I've been wandering for 12 years, Holt said, his voice low and intent. "Tracking Blackburn, taking odd jobs, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. I told myself it was because I needed to find him to make him pay. But the truth is, I was afraid to care about anything or anyone, afraid I'd lose them like I lost my parents. And now," Rosalie held her breath, afraid to hope. Holt's free hand came up to touch her cheek, just as it had the night before, but this time he didn't pull away. "Now I'm thinking maybe it's time to stop running, to build something instead of just seeking to destroy." His eyes searched hers. "The Lazy S is going to need rebuilding. New stock, repairs to the buildings, hands to work the land. That's a big job for one person. Are you offering to help?" Rosalie asked, a smile beginning to form despite herself. "I'm offering more than that," Holt said. "If you'll have me." Before she could respond, he leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, but when Rosalie's arms came up around his neck, it deepened into something more powerful. All the fear, relief, and unspoken feelings of the past few days seemed to pour into that kiss, leaving them both breathless when they finally pulled apart. "I'll take that as a yes," Holt said, a real smile transforming his face. Rosalie laughed, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. "Yes," she confirmed. "Though I should warn you, I have very definite ideas about how to run a ranch." "I'd expect nothing less," he replied, wincing slightly as his wounded side protested the movement. "Come on," Rosalie said, taking his arm. "Let's get you to Dr. Collins before you bleed all over my clean dress." As they walked back to join the others, the townspeople of Silver Creek watched with knowing smiles. Hannah Whitfield dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Reverend Adams beamed like a proud father. "Reckon that settles who's going to be running the Lazy S," Jacob Hargrove remarked to no one in particular. Dr. Collins treated Holt's wound, a painful but relatively minor graze across his ribs, and insisted he rest for at least a day before attempting the ride back to the Lazy S. Rosalie stayed by his side throughout, her hand in his, as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. The next morning, a telegram arrived from Helena. The federal marshal would be arriving within 3 days to take custody of Blackburn and his men, and to begin a full investigation into the land transactions throughout the territory. Ethan Parker's meticulous records would be crucial evidence. By afternoon, Holt was restless and insisted he was well enough to travel. Rosalie, equally eager to return to her ranch, their ranch didn't argue too strenuously. The Weber brothers offered to accompany them, and by sunset, They were riding through the gates of the Lazy S. The ranch showed signs of neglect after weeks of abandonment, but no serious damage. Blackburn had been too busy hunting Rosalie to make many changes to the property. The cattle had scattered without regular handling, but they were still on Sutherland rangeland and could be gathered again. As they rode into the yard, Rosalie felt a bittersweet ache. This place held so many memories of her father, of her childhood. But now it would hold new memories, a new future she never could have imagined a week ago when she was running for her life. "Welcome home," Holt said quietly, watching her face as she took in the familiar buildings, the corrals, the bunkhouse. Rosalie looked at him, this man who had stepped into her life at her darkest moment and changed everything. "Welcome home," she echoed, and knew she wasn't just talking about the ranch. Rebuilding wasn't easy. It took weeks to gather the scattered cattle and assess the true state of the ranch's operations. Holt sent word to contacts he had throughout the territory, and gradually, reliable hands arrived to work the Lazy S. The Weber brothers stayed on, proving themselves invaluable both as cowboys and as friends. News came from Silver Creek that the federal investigation was proceeding swiftly. Blackburn and his closest associates had been transferred to Helena to await trial. Land that had been stolen was being returned to rightful owners or their heirs. Hannah Whitfield had inherited her husband's ranch and was determined to make a go of it, with help from neighbors. One evening in late summer, Rosalie sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. She heard Holt's footsteps before she saw him, recognizing the steady rhythm of his walk. He sat beside her on the porch swing, his arm automatically going around her shoulders as she leaned into him. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the changing colors of the sky. "I got a letter today," Holt said eventually, "from my uncle in Kentucky. I wrote to him after we got back here, told him I'd finally found the man responsible for my parents' deaths." "What did he say?" Rosalie asked, knowing how important this connection to Holt's past was to him. "He's happy I found some peace. Happier still that I've found you." Holt's hand stroked her arm lightly. "He wants to come visit, see the ranch, see us." Rosalie smiled. "I'd like that. Family is important." Holt shifted slightly, reaching into his pocket. "Speaking of family," he said, his voice unusually hesitant, "I've been thinking." He produced a small leather pouch and tipped its contents into his palm, a simple gold band set with a single small diamond. "It was my mother's," he explained. "My uncle saved it for me, sent it along with his letter." Rosalie's heart seemed to stop, then race forward. "Holt." "I know it's only been a few months," he said, suddenly looking younger, more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. "And I'm not a man of fancy words, but I love you, Rosalie Sutherland. You're the bravest, strongest woman I've ever known. I want to build a life with you, right here if you'll have me." Tears filled Rosalie's eyes as she cupped his face in her hands. "Holt Jackson, I've known since the moment you cut me free from those ropes that my life would never be the same. I love you too, more than I ever thought possible." His smile was like the sunrise breaking slowly across his face. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," Rosalie laughed through her tears. 1,000 times yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if it had been made for her all along. Their kiss was a promise, a beginning, sealing a bond that had been forged in the fire of danger and hardship but would flourish in peace and love. They were married 2 weeks later in the Methodist Church in Silver Creek, with Reverend Adams officiating and what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Hannah Whitfield wept happy tears, Jacob Hargrove beamed proudly, and the Weber brothers whooped so loudly during the first kiss that even the dignified Dr. Collins couldn't help but laugh. The celebration continued at the Lazy S, where tables had been set up in the yard and every ranch hand for 20 miles had been invited. There was music and dancing, food and drink, and stories told late into the night around blazing bonfires. As the evening waned, Holt led Rosalie away from the festivities to a quiet spot near the corral fence. In the moonlight, with the sounds of celebration behind them, he took her in his arms. "Mrs. Jackson," he said, testing the name on his tongue. "I like the sound of that," Rosalie replied, her arms twining around his neck. "So do I." Holt's eyes were warm as they gazed down at her. "Thank you." "For what?" "For giving me a home, a purpose beyond revenge, a future I never thought I'd have." Rosalie smiled up at her husband, this man who had saved her from a fate worse than death, who had helped her reclaim her home and her life, who now looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "We saved each other," she said simply, and knew it was true. As they returned to their guests, to the laughter and music and celebration of new beginnings, Rosalie caught a glimpse of the branding iron hanging above the ranch house door, not Blackburn's, but the original Lazy S brand that had been her grandfather's. Once a simple tool for marking ownership, it now served as a reminder of how close she had come to bearing such a mark herself, and of the man who had prevented it. The man who had cut her bonds, who had stood beside her against impossible odds, who now stood beside her in a new life built from the ashes of tragedy. A life that stretched before them, full of promise and possibility, on the land they both loved. Their story would become legend in that part of Montana, the tale of a brave young woman who refused to be broken, and the loyal cowboy who cut her free with his knife, who chose love over vengeance, and who found his own freedom in the process. A story told around campfires and on front porches for generations to come. A story of courage, of justice, of redemption. A love story.